think especially because Tisha B'Av is coming up with all the events going on and these parshah, the Shabbos Chazon. So it's maybe we'll put off the 13 principles that are going to start either after or at some point in time we'll do it all, but just focus on this week's parsha because it has a very central, very important theme that really is the theme of all history, but it comes in a very subtle way. And it has to do with the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu says to Bnei Israel, he's recounting the whole episode, the whole story, the travels, and he points out that it was only 11 days' journey from Har Sinai to Eretz Yisrael if they had gone direct. And at first, it's a point in passing, not really so significant. Doesn't ring a bell unless you really know what's going on. I happened to look up as part of this, and looked up the whole thing with the 11s, all the 11s to do with September 11th and the Twin Towers, and so I came across the site, Snopes and True and False, and these sites that's basically research this stuff, the emails going around, and try and verify it. And it was a little unusual because the way that normally is it's just true or false. And did this thing happen? This thing not happen in the end? So it wasn't exactly like that here, because it wasn't like, did this email go, or did this email not go, or these 11s true or they're not true, basically, because the 11s are all true. The World Trade Center or New York City has 11 letters. It's not a question of true or false. The question really was, is there any significance to this? So they actually posted somebody's smart aleck remark to the whole thing about how he just turned 11s to kind of, he mocked the whole thing. I worked at, I think that You Are Idiot also has 11 letters too, but wasn't exactly going to post that one. But it's like you're always going to get that type of a mocking going on. The thing is, the difference is over here is that they don't know the significance of the number 11. As far as they're concerned, the significance came up because what happened on September 11th. Now the truth is, I don't know the last time a major catastrophe occurred where everyone jumped in and started looking for gematrias and numbers that were significant to do with the event itself. I mean, there's always like some Kabbalist somewhere doing something like that, but the Western world in general, secular people in general, they're not really want to go ahead and look for all kinds of significance in the dates and the times and things like that. It really only happened as far as I can see, as much as I checked out, to do with the attack on the Twin Towers. That's interesting in and itself because it's a unique event. And but the underlying basis of their confusion or their disagreement or their inability, because you'll always get naysayers, you'll always get people who don't want significance in these events. They don't want it to be there was any kind of significance at all whatsoever. But the reason why they can have that type of discussion is because nobody really knows what the significance is other than the fact that it all happened on that day. There's a kind of a freaky experience as far as people are concerned, meaning that if you look at the coincidence of how basically that the buildings are in the shape of an 11, right? The actual stand-up is the shape of 11, which is unusual. That it happened on September 11th. 9 plus 1 plus 1 is 11. That Flight 11 crashed into the towers, and there's a whole series of 11s that go along with this. And the person who was basically saying this had no significance was just saying that you take any event historically, you'll probably be able to find some very important key numbers that happen to do with the event itself, but it means nothing in the end. The same way, for example, that they ran the email that said true or false, that every time the American government tries to do something to tamper with the borders of Israel, the land of Israel, some major natural catastrophe takes place in the States. True or false? So the article said true. They actually said true, because the events were the events. And they were saying, yes, there's no question, this happened, and then this was followed by this event, and this happened, and this was followed by this event, and since then it keeps coming. It keeps happening, year after year, the same thing. The more they try and touch the borders, the more significant things actually take place that are natural disasters. So, but the article, the response was, but that doesn't mean it's significant. The fact that you have 10 events followed by 10 events, and that's not, who says that means anything? In other words, who says there was any kind of divine providence? The fact that Katrina took place the week after Gush Katif, and the first letters of Katif are the same as Katrina. And the same scenario kind of took place down in New Orleans was taking place in Gush Katif because people lost their homes. They put X's across the door and all kinds of stuff like that. A lot of similarities, but who says that's significant in the end? So that's true. Who says that's significant? The truth is that there is a significance to these things, and it all comes down to if you believe in God, you believe in Hashgacha Pratis, and then first of all, you just calculate the odds. Like, what are the odds, like statistically speaking, that this type of thing so connected is going to occur within 1 week over the course of thousands of years of history? What are the odds it's going to happen like that? And the odds basically become astronomically very, very small that it's going to be a random thing. That there must be some significance, but they can't deal with it. They don't want to deal with it. People don't want to find out that these things are connected, because if you do, it implies some kind of responsibility. The same way in Noah's generation, they didn't want to find out that there was some kind of connection to what was going on historically and the way they were behaving, because if it does, it means I'm responsible to some degree. People don't want to take responsibility because they don't want the party to end. It's not just secular people, it's religious people too. Right? After Katrina took place, priests, I was in the States at the time, I was actually in Canada at the time, and there was all kinds of reporting taking place. I actually was in Eretz Yisrael when Gush Katif was being emptied out, and I was in Canada, the States, the next week when this whole hurricane took place. So I was actually able to see both sides of the story within 1 week, and I saw the similarities. And he had all these priests standing up, these sort of right-wing Christian fundamentalist priests, and he was saying, and this is because that we have been trying to play with the borders of the land of Israel, and it's God's land, give it to God's people, and you can't do things like this, and this is God's wrath against the American people for trying to play games with the borders of the Jewish people. That's, and then these Reform and Conservative, and maybe even some modern Orthodox rabbis got up, because the Orthodox ones didn't hear they don't watch TV, so they don't hear this. Basically, so they got up and said, you can't say things like that. You can't make connections. You can't, the implications, of course, are, if it's in fact it's true that God is running the world, He's here right now, He's behind history, and there's significance to the land of Israel, and it means something to me. And I have to respond to that in some way, on some level. So people don't want to know there's a connection. They break the connection. So that basically is tantamount to what the Torah says that Amalek does. Amalek is mafreed between Yud-K and Vav-K, right? The Kosh Baruch Hu's four-letter name, Yud-K, Vav-K, is the shlemus of Hashgacha Pratis, meaning when this name is one and is whole, and the Kosh Baruch Hu is perceived as, his name is one, so then it basically shows up historically in as much as everybody can sing the hand of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. When the birds became silent as the Jewish people were receiving Torah, and they asked Bilam, what's pshat, what's going on over here? So Bilam said, God is talking to the Jewish people, giving His Torah right now. When the man went into the ground, it melted into the ground and showed up in the rivers around the world. The people drank it and tasted a bit of the man. Right? People knew that was the man. Where that sweet taste from, it was the man. So everybody, as evil as they were, Nebuchadnezzar got up, Shekhavas, the Zachariah, the Kosh Baruch Hu, they might have been evil, but there was an acknowledgement. At some point in time, history takes a turn where the leaders of the world, they just stop believing at some point in time. People stop seeing the reality of Kosh Baruch Hu, and that's the work of Amalek, when you disconnect events of history from their Torah meaning. That's an Amalekian thing to do. So some people would argue and say, but that there's an inherent mistake that you could make if you try to do that. When you start making connections that don't exist, as this person's response is basically saying, making fun of the entire thing. So then you run the risk of reading meaning into things that doesn't exist, and then making big things out of things that aren't important. And you can go off the deep end and make all kinds of mistakes as a result of that. It's a double-edged sword. There's always the possibility. So the starting point is knowing what's significant and what's not significant from a Torah perspective. What's the source? Do you have a source for a thing like that? Is 11 in itself significant, especially since the fact that it followed the year of Y2K, and Y2K, as we put up before in Hebrew, is Yud Beis Kuf, also a lovely coincidence. In fact, it's such a thing as coincidence, right? And that might not have meant too much had it not been followed the following year by war and following the Shemitah cycle. There are things taking place in that event specifically that had a significance. So, it says the following thing. So I get past my passcode, everything. Right? This is found in the Yalkut Riveni. He says the following thing. The 11 klipos correspond to the 11 tribes that Moshe blessed before his death in order to weaken these forces, which Kabbalists note to be the basis for the 11 curtains in the Mishkan, the 11 spices in the incense offering, the 11 verses that begin with the letter Nun and end with the letter Nun, all of which correspond to the 11 klipos, which cause forgetfulness, which is why 11 Tehillah, 11 Psalms are forgotten when Moshe died. Okay? So off the bat, from that, out of nowhere, that's on this week's Parashat, based upon the number 11. So it turns out that the 11, and Rashi brings it down, don't remember exactly if Rashi brings it down, but it is brought down that the 11 signified the Jewish people have been rui, to be able to go from Har Sinai to Eretz Yisrael in 11 days. They would have won the battle. They would have won the war. Meaning, they would have brought completion to Ma'aseh Bereshis. 11 days is definitely significant. Why? Actually, it says right here in the Sifri. It says in the Sifri, had the Jewish people married the 11 days, they would have entered the land because the 11 days would have overcome the 11 klipos, which are the 11 chiefs of Esav. So what does that mean? What does it mean? What's the significance of that? What's it supposed to? What is that? How does it play itself out in terms of history, right? So, looking for 1 second. Just looking for. I did actually put that quote in here. Oh, here it is. This is the Kabbalistic basis of the number 11. This is the following thing. This is the reason why the cycle length of the sun and the moon are not equal, but rather the sun's cycle extends beyond the moon's by 11 days. The Malchus is missing 11 lights, which are from the 320, 280, and 288 sparks. I don't know Kabbalah understand what that actually refers to, but this goes back to pre-Ma'aseh Bereshis, which are continuously being rectified until the arrival of Mashiach. Thus, because of these 11 lights that are missing from the Malchus, there are 11 days missing from the lunar calendar with respect to the solar one. So it turns out that 11 is extremely significant from a Kabbalistic perspective, because when the Kodesh Baruch Hu is making Ma'aseh Bereshis, everything is tikkun the entire way through. He's taking at this, he's doing that, organizing, rearranging, making the grass, making the fish, making the seeds, making the shemaim. He's doing it all, basically. And if he keeps going and does not stop the process of rectification, nothing is going to be left for man to do. So what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? He stops at a certain point in the process of Ma'aseh Bereshis, and at that point he leaves over for man to do his thing to rectify the world. What's actually left over in his rectification? It turns out there are 11 lights that are left down in the klipos, unrectified, that somehow through our Torah mitzvahs and our Yisurim, our suffering, the events of history, whatever is going on historically, every single last detail of life, from the most mundane to the most meaningful. There's nothing outside of this. It's all to do with this. It's not like, you got to work at a job, right? So, a person does their job, they go for lunch. When they're having lunch, they're not at work anymore. They sort of leave work behind and they go for lunch. In fact, they purposely leave work behind and they don't want to get involved, bring the two, back together one thing. Like the CEO, you have no choice, and you have a business lunch. But, there's a separation. You go home, spend time with your family, you read the newspaper, relax. It's like a different world. It's a different mitzvah. There's work and there's this. But by this, there's no such separation. It's all one and the same thing. When you go to sleep, when you get up, how you get up, what you say, what you don't say, how you behave, your midas, not your midas. It's all basically comes down to one thing, that you're rectifying these 11 lights, whether you know about them or you don't. Whether you believe in it, whether you don't believe in it. Whether you understand how to go about rectification or you don't. But it doesn't make a difference. It's all plugging in to the rectification of these 11 lights. That's what's going on. So 11 becomes an extremely important number. It's the basis of all rectification. It's not just a number that shows up somehow later on in history, by September 11th in the shape of a builder, in the shape of 11, but 11 itself predates, pre-exists Ma'aseh Bereshis, and that's what history is coming to fix up. So once you have the basis of an understanding that this, in fact, is inherently significant, so then you approach from the other direction. And you can start saying, well then, where does 11 keep showing up? And why does it keep showing up over here? Why specifically over there? What's the message? So without going to the whole Hanukkah shir again, because it's too much to go into, but as much as it's relative to this week's parshah, this Kodesh Baruch Hu says to Moshe quotes, the Torah quotes Moshe ben Asinti Kodesh Baruch Hu Eicha, right? How we actually read it, and actually when it's read with the same Talmud Mikra as we do Eicha itself, because it's a connection. So psychologically, that's just part of the preparation for Tisha B'Av coming up, just like with the Haftorah as well, the same idea. But Eicha does not show up very often in the entire Torah. It just shows up really at the very beginning, where Kodesh Baruch Hu comes to Moshe Ben, comes to Adam Rishon, and says Ayeka. There it's not actually Eicha, it's Ayeka. Ayeka is actually not a word, it's a gematria, 36. And likewise, there's a connection over here. So is it too much of a leap of one's imagination to say that somehow the 11 days is tied to the Eicha over here, especially since HaKadosh Baruch Hu's response to Adam was with respect to actually destroying the progress of Ma'aseh Bereishis by eating from the Eitz Das Tov Hara. So it turns out, there's a reason, aside from that, there's not... Take out the basket over here. I ran out of toner, so I couldn't print out my notes. So I'm very stuck to do this today. But it turns out that... Let's look at the source here. It's also easier. That it's brought down in Kabbalah. Das actually is represented by the number 11 because it is so-called 11th Sphira. So we know there are only 10 spheres of Ma'aseh Bereishis. And Das, basically, the word Das itself just means knowledge. But Das itself is a level of reality that actually fluctuates. All the other 10 spheres, from Keser down to the bottom of Malchus, for the most part, are a fixed reality. We do affect them by drawing light into the lower ones, but they're basically there. They were there before Ma'aseh Bereishis. They're there after Ma'aseh Bereishis. The only sphere of all the spherot that actually goes up and goes down and can be there or disappear based upon the actions of man is the sphere of Das. Now it's called the 11th sphere, but it's not really the 11th sphere because really Das, when Das is in the picture, Keser itself is not. So there's always 10, but it's still referred to kind of as a pseudo-sphere, and it's called the 11th sphere. That's why there are 11 spices of the incense offering, and 11 keeps showing up all over the place because that's what we're trying to rectify. When Adam ate, it was simply an issue of obedience, which Baruch Hu wanted to see whether or not Adam could be a good boy and not break his father's commandment. He simply could have said, don't eat from the forbidden fruit, from the forbidden tree. Don't stick your hand in the cookie jar before supper. Whatever. There's all kinds of ways to test the loyalty of somebody. Why is it Dafka Eitz Das Tov Hara? Why is Das the issue? Why was the test itself with Das at the very beginning? It didn't have to be that way. It could have just been Eitz Tov Hara, and that would have been significant in itself, and therefore the test would still be a test of loyalty, but specifically it's Das itself, because the test wasn't simply what you're going to eat, but the test is actually how you relate to the whole concept of Das in the first place. So what's Das Tov Hara? We would assume that Das is always a positive thing. Knowledge is always a positive thing. It turns out that this Das Tov Hara, right? So if the number 11 represents Das, then it means there must be a positive 11 and there must be a negative 11. Here's where the Chanukah Shir sort of comes in a bit over here, for those who forget, right? Now, these are just givens because I can't take the time right now to prove this to be true. Read the book and go back to an earlier Shir. Right, but the idea is that it is very basically this. This is the Chanukah story. This is really the purpose of Bnei Yisrael, what we're doing here, and how we rectify creation. 25 is a number that represents the light with which HaKadosh Baruch Hu made Ma'aseh Bereishis. But as Rashi points out in the fourth pasuk, HaKadosh Baruch Hu hid that light. He hid that light. He used the light to make Ma'aseh Bereishis, and then he hid that light. That light is called the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light of creation. We know that 36 represents the light once it's revealed, because Chanukah is about pursuing Nisa, the revealing of the light, 36 lights, 36 tractors and Talmud Bavli. For 36 hours, the Gemara says the Rishama, the light shone for Adam before Kosh Baruch Hu finally hit it. So 36 is always a number that loses the light once it's revealed. Lo and behold, how do you get from 25 to 36? It turns out that it's the number 11. Mathematically, perfect. You find very few elegant equations like that in Hashkafa. In mathematics, you might find it, but not so much for mathematics. The Hashkafa come together. It works out beautifully because the conceptual reality is 100% true, and so is the numerical, but it gets even better. Because not only if you add 11 to 25, you get 36, but if you take negative 11, which is negative Das, right? And, Das is, positive Das is 11, negative 11 is negative Das, and you subtract it from 25, not only do you not get the 36, which reveals the light of Ma'aseh Bereishis, which is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked Adam Arish, Ayek, which is Gematria 36, meaning where's the light that was supposed to be revealed? I made the light, I hid the light, your action was supposed to reveal it, and it didn't reveal it in the end. Right? So now you take the 25 and subtract 11, you get 14. Is 14 significant? So it turns out that 14 is significant. Why? Because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is making Ma'aseh Bereishis, Rashi points out that the light comes down, comes down, comes down. Remember, it's not going to fix up 11 lights. How's it represented? It turns out that the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shekai itself, is a name that means Shedai, meaning HaKadosh Baruch Hu said die. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu made Ma'aseh Bereishis, He said die, meaning enough. The light should not go down any further. What's the Gematria of the word die is 14. Why? Because when the light came down, it stopped 14 levels from the bottom to leave room for evil to exist. So there could be free will. So there could be the challenge of rectification for mankind. We can participate in the whole process. Our job is to bring the light down to the very bottom, to sanctify all of my separations in the end. That's what the 14 represents. So therefore, you have a perfect equation. 25 plus 11 equals 36. That's the revelation of the light. 25 subtract 11 equals 14. That's the hiding of the light. So therefore, Kodesh Baruch Hu says by Amalek, right, who's mafreed between Yud K and Vav K, which is the 15 plus the 11. Vav K is 11, right? So he's mafreed. He separates. He breaks up people's understanding of Ashkacha Pratis. So what does Kodesh Baruch Hu say? Yad al Keska. My hand is on my throne, taking a shvua, and I'm at war with Amalek for all the generations that come from this point onward until he's finally destroyed. And every last bit of him has to be destroyed. You can't even say behind his animals or even a single belt or whatever, nothing. Whatever, when he goes, everything of his has to go in the end, right? What's the Gematria of the word Yad is 14 because that's Amalek's reality. So the 11 is extremely significant because basically what it does in the end, as it points out, Al Pisod, the 11 is the source, it's the lights that were not rectified, which is the source of 11 klipot. Klipot basically is just the reality of spiritual impurity that we have to contend with on some level at some point in time, right? And that is the source, that negativity, that negative energy in Maisa Bereshis is the source of none other than 11 chiefs, tribes of Esau in the end, right? And that's the antithesis to Yaakov Avinu. So therefore, it stands to reason that 11 represents Yaakov, and negative 11 represents Esav. So that's the mathematical expression of the Eitzadas Tov Ra. It's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? Which means basically the 25 represents the tree and the light that's hidden inside. The positive 11 is the Tov. The negative 11 is the Ra. Right, so basically you have an expression, a mathematical expression of the original Eitzadas Tov Ra and the work that we're here to do to rectify and transform. Because what happens in the end of history is the Eitzadas Tov Ra is transformed after all we go through, all the Torah we learn. The Eitzer Chaim. The Eitzer Chaim is no longer any Ra anymore, so it's only Eitzadas Tov, which means the negative 11 finally disappears because all the lights get rectified and fixed up at that point in time. So that's the significance of the number 11. So that's why, as Rashi points out, the basic rule of thumb is if you're not going to rectify the world with 11, you'll be consumed by it. The 11 will consume you. If you're not going to pursue positive dust, you're not going to pursue the type of knowledge necessary to be able to look at my separations and see where the light is hidden and how to extract it, how to bring it out. When you're making Shabbos, that's what you're doing. Right now, we're having a shir, that's what we're doing right now. You daven Mariv, that's what you just did right now. You're bringing the light. Somehow you're extracting the light out of my separations that previously was hidden. You daven Mariv every single day. It's a different light that's coming out. The same light, it's not like it goes back and you bring it back like a caterpillar. It goes back into this light. You pull it out again second time. What you pulled, you pulled out in the end. That's what it's all about. Every single word that comes out of our mouth, it's all part of the same process in the end. So if you're not going to be like Yaakov, then you'll be consumed by Esav in the end. And the Esav way of life. That's the basic idea. So therefore, by the Mabul, right, as Rashi points out, almost, who even really cares, in a sense, but that, make sure I don't want this to go to sleep. Yeah, sure. It's all tied us in the, 100%. So every time you see 11, it's always going to be somehow tied back to that. But so Rashi brings down the pasuk as says that the Teva came to rest in the 7th month, right? In the 7th month. Look at my screen. I moved the whole thing. Right on the 17th of the month of Ara. Rashi throws in. He says from here you can infer that the ark was submerged in the waters to a depth of 11 amos. We already know from the pasuk the waters actually rose above the highest mountain by 15 amos. But the Teva, the world of man, was submerged into the water by 11 amos. Who cares? Yeah, who cares? What? Unless, of course, these numbers have significance. So 15 is the Yud K. The waters are going up, towards Shemayim, right? The Vav K is going down. There's a separation taking place. Measure for measure, midah keneged midah, because Baruch Hu says here, if you're not going to be meyachid the Yud K and the Vav K in your actions, what does that mean? How are you meyachid? By simply connecting up the events of history with Hashgacha Pratis, seeing the meaning in the events, taking the musar from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's warnings, and making changes to your life and the world around you to suit that. You lose nothing from doing that. There's no, all that it means basically is taking responsibility for your actions and the world and the direction it's going. That's what the Mabul was teaching. If you're not going to meyachid and do the work of Amalek and bring together the Yud K, which is a 15, and the Vav K, then they'll become separate through you. Your will will become separated. And you'll feel abandoned, and the world basically goes to, you have Holocaust, you have world wars, and all the negative events of history. Okay, so that's the background. You can lie down if you want to. I feel like you're suffering here.
It's curious that you have.
It wasn't worth it.
You have 36.
Right.
And 25.
Right.
So the difference is 11. But also, 25 is 5 squared. And 36
And
is 6 squared.
right.
5 and 6 is 11.
Okay. Didn't hear that one before. That's good. I like that.
Is it the same idea of darkness as the absence of light? You know, if you're not going to put light on, the default is going to.
Well, basically, yeah,
Something
that is
like
the same idea because there's no neutrality. There's no neutral ground
Right.
over here.
You shut off the light, it's dark.
Yeah, if you're not bringing light to the world, it's not like there's going to be some in between stage.
It's
It's
just
going to
dark.
result in darkness, and the darkness will be consuming. It's not just darkness itself, but actually becomes consuming. So, having said that, right now, basically, that's what the 11 represents for Klal Yisrael. The fact that they were unable to go directly from Har Sinai to Eretz Yisrael means that they were not in a position to do the final tikkun for Ma'aseh Bereshis. They weren't able to take the 11, add to 25, and the 36. That's the Gula Shlema. That's what it comes down to in the end. So the rest of history is simply trying to rectify that. It's the same idea as going from Yaakov to Yisrael. Same type of concept. So if Klal Yisrael is in fact responding the way they're supposed to respond, they're real with the Shkacha Pratis at the level Kosh Baruch Hu means it to be taken, then they'll make the connection, that will draw the light out of the reality, and that will bring the 36 as opposed to the 14. That's the basic formula. So that's why it's significant. And I can't tell you for sure this is the case, but the irony and the coincidence are just too tremendous. The very fact that the World Trade Center itself is situated and looks like a number 11, and it's not just any building. This is the building represents the financial district of Asa. This is Asa's symbol of his power. That was literally, from even an architectural point of view, right there at the shore, almost next to the Statue of Liberty, and you come into America saying, this is who we are, this is what we're all about. We're about this 11, about this material world. The fact it's called Twin Towers as well, that you have Yaakov and Esav being twins, and this reality is actually embedded in this very concept, but even more importantly, that comes after the year 2000, which itself is a Geula type year because everyone's worried about the changing of the computer. Okay, it was a dud, it wasn't exactly dead, it cost a lot of money to fix it. But the fact that it should have a name, not just the Millennium Bug, but it should be called Y2K, which in Hebrew is Yud Beis Kuf, which spells the word Yabok, which might not be significant except for the fact that the Rizal says Yabok symbolizes the transition from Yaakov to Israel. Because what's the whole point of that? Yaakov is the twin brother of Esav. And because Yaakov is the twin brother of Esav, he has the potential to be like Esav, just like Esav has the potential to be like Yaakov to some degree. The Christian world became religious. They even wear kippah. The Pope wears a kippah, a red one, because that's the symbol of Esav. In the end, that's his color, his favorite color, right?
So Yaakov and Esav together, you're saying there, and then the Yishmael on the other side of the world coming over.
So Yishmael is a little bit different. In a sense, Yishmael is what is the reality that happens when Yaakov fails to make the separation from Esav completely, right? Yishmael is more like a counterculture, which is why he's more tied to Yitzchak as opposed to Yaakov itself. So Yishmael will always come in the picture whenever Esav's world overcomes Yaakov. That's why you'll notice like Esav is this anti-materialism type reality, right? And it represents the Chamor as opposed to the shore. The Gra held that the main battle Mashiach ben Yosef is against Amalek and Esav, and the main battle of Mashiach ben David is against Yishmael in the end. Because if you look at the end of history, what's the net result of Jewish history at this point in time, the main obstacle we have to bring the rectification and bring the Gula Shlema vis-a-vis ourselves is materialism, which is totally absorbed from Esa's culture. We've actually we take Esa's culture and we adapt it, we kasher it, so to speak, and make it as firm as we possibly can. But the net result often is a overly attached relationship to host lands, gashmis, and unable to be able to face up the reality what's going on in the world around us. And that all changed on September 11th in 2001. That relationship, until that time, people did not look at life in the Western world as something that was going to come to an end. They felt it would go on forever, even though they'd like to still believe it today. They live their lives to that to some degree. People feel more transient today because what happened, the events of September 11th, and all that happened since then, which is all a follow-up reality. So the very fact that happened after the year 2001, which is Yabok, basically symbolizing the crossing over of the river where Yaakov fights with the Sar Shel Esav to make the separation, is now called Yisrael. Yisrael is kind of a hybrid. He's not really anymore part of the Yaakov. It's like Esav. And the very fact that the Yabok, according to the Rizal, is the Rosh Tevis of Yaniniv Yom Karenu, which is talking about the Yom Geula, the day of Geula itself. So Yabok itself represents the whole concept of the transformation process. At the same time, the land of Eretz Yisrael is developing itself, getting it to a point where it can now be makabel its people, right? It's not like the swamps anymore. We're no longer draining swamps, getting malaria and all these illnesses. Even the wars we have to fight, miraculously, we're still here. We're still living our lifestyles. Things going, normally. The most amazing thing I remember, hearing, some video that the army put together on YouTube. Someone wants to watch these things. It's airful. And he was talking about how when the wars break out, the policy of the Israeli army is to try and fight the wars in such a way that the citizens do not have to change their lifestyle. So you got 5 huge, monstrous Arab nations surrounding this place, where it's like it's like a fly living next to a huge giant who takes one step and it'll splat, you're gone. Right? Like this huge, enemies surrounding us. And if we had a large country to defend the border, like let's say Saudi Arabia or something like that, so we can take the fight to the borders and leave the main, the central area unaffected, be one thing. But it's a small, tiny little land where you fire a shot over here, you can barely hear, almost hear it over there. It's like, how do you keep it out of the citizens' lifestyle? How do you keep it away from it? And yet it does. When they went into Gaza, they fought the war. Most of us had no idea. When the North fighting in Lebanon, most people had no idea what was going on. And I just thought it was very strange until I found that was actually the policy. The policy was they do not want Israeli people to feel that when a war is going on, their lives have to change. Remarkable, it's a tremendous idea. I don't know how often you can live by that, but the fact that that's the consciousness, such a small country, is nothing short of a fantastic miracle that it can actually take place b'chol whatsoever. To have all this development taking place, and at the same time, the shekel detaches itself from the dollar that people thought would never happen, could never happen in the end, that the economy gets stronger as the Western world starts to get weaker, and all these things happening at one time. It's like a certain amount of independence that implies that the balance of Klal Yisrael, the shift of power, is shifting. It's changing, right? There's a momentum change over here. It's not what was going on for the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 decades in the Western world after Europe collapsed, and the Jews were forced to leave. It's no longer the same. It's like the same way you shop at a house and a little bit earlier Shabbos, and your host hasn't a chance to prepare your room yet. So you're sitting downstairs in the living room reading a book, and all of a sudden, at some point in time, but they're upstairs preparing the room. So people going back and forth carrying the sheets, right? And a bottle of water, whatever it's going to, and you can't see what's going on inside there, but just waiting. At some point, they come in and say, your room's ready. So Kush Baruch Hu, it's exactly what's going on the last 60, 70 years. Preparing the place, your room is ready. Your country is now ready. It's so incredibly obvious, but people don't go. The miracle is absolutely awesome, and people don't take note of it. So what happens basically, it takes a shocking event. Things have to wake you up and shock you to the point that basically it says that, take a look what's going on over here. One of the most instructive midrashim has to be the one where it says all that happened to Yosef is going to happen to Tzion. Not to Bnei Israel, not to Eretz Israel, but to Tzion. Tzion is the namesake, as we said before 1,000 times, is the name of the Jewish people and Eretz Israel and Torah, the time of Geula. That's Tzion. The Nevi'im use the word Tzion. However, it's been used and borrowed and switched around, whatever. But the reality is, Tzion is the name that Kosh Baruch Hu is Koveya for Klal Yisrael at the end of history in a time of Geula. And the Medrash is whatever is going to happen to Yosef is going to happen to Tzion because the Gematria of Yosef and Tzion are one of the same thing, 156. And based upon that, the Gra has 156 aspects or levels of Mashiach and Yosef, but it has to be done, right? A very significant number. But the main thing, the main thing of Yosef's life that's going to be replicated, the people have to ask the question, they know the story of Yosef, they should be asking themselves, like, am I part of this conspiracy over here? Because what happened by Yosef? The most important thing that happened by Yosef was he was the one that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose, and 10 tzaddikim rejected him. And they couldn't possibly fathom how he could be the one that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose and set up, and his dreams and this, and became, second in command of Egypt. It's just like totally, like two ships passing in total different lanes at nighttime, completely different takes on reality. Completely different. To such an extent, and the Torah goes out of its way to portray this. It goes out of its way to portray this. It's remarkable. We know this story, read to the kids before they go to bed. It's like...
Same with David HaMelech also, when they were shocked
Mm-hmm.
that the person in the field, but compared to all the brothers, they all thought they were going to be the king.
To such an that even Shmuel, couldn't believe it. It was the Shem and Zayat that had to jump out of the little Karen, like looking for David.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting, right? Got any more sons here? No, these are all. Wow, we got one of them that feels like he's cleaning up right now. He's just fighting with bears and lions and things like that. He's red and he's ruddy and he's not king material, right? Yeah, bring him in anyhow. Right? And they bring him in, he comes in, and the Shem and Zai is like, gotta anoint that guy. He's like, Shmuel's going, oh. It's like, am I missing something here? Right? It's like, what's happening? They're all going, that's not the brother we thought we knew. Right? And Yeshaiah's going, him? He's the one? Right? All this controversy, and his mother, this, it's like, incredible. And he wasn't even vindicated while he was alive. Only after he died, by Shlomo's time, the Gemara says in Shabbos, he was finally vindicated, and this is all going all through history. And then the Rizal explains what we call Mimus Tachbolis. Mimus Tachbolis, he says, is a concept that a Kosh Baruch Hu brings the Gula through the back door when we're not zeichet to bring it through the front door. And what's the back door? Well, you have Avraham being born from Terech and his wife, who at that time shouldn't have been able to conceive, let alone give birth to Avraham Avinu, right? And then you have Yitzchak being born to such a degree that we have to have like a facial change over here to make sure people go, he's from Avimelech, right? This guy is the wrong father. These are the Avos. We got to come back in history. And Yaakov is his struggle. Okay, there's no problem but he has to buy the birthright. He's a thief. Our whole history, comes down to stealing the Bechor and doing it, and what do you call it when you compulsion, because he's starving to death. Where you buy, I'll feed you and save your life. Only if you give me the Bechor, right? And you go for your father, take the brachas, and it's like everything's backwards and upside down. So the reason also that's called Mimus Tachbos, because if it happened to the front door, there's a Acher would sniff and see the Gula coming and be all over it, like he was with the Gra, right? They said the Gra to go back up because the Sitra Acher knew this great rabbi gets Eretz Yisrael and starts the Yishuv all over again. We're finished. That's the beginning of the end for the Sitra Achra. So they have to stop him. That's just, Makatra can stop and do all these things. Why? Because the Jewish people don't know how to add 25 plus 11 to get 36. 25 plus 10, 25 plus 9, 8. No, that's still not working out. 3,000 years later, once in a while we get this 11 in there, build the base of Mikdash, but even that lasted for one night. In the end, it just doesn't work out in the end. This 11 is just like hanging and hovering over your head, and instead negative dust as opposed to positive dust, right? It's like So then you have an incident like 2 weeks ago, as we spoke about last week. It's like totally off the grid. That totally throws us for a loop. We can't, where do you put that? How do you, how do you compartmentalize that? How do you actually fit it into Jewish history? Well, the truth is you go back in history, you find, we mentioned last week, not to go over it again, but the whole thing with the Pelegish of Givah, and also a very, very bizarre event, and a rule was laid down over there. And the rule was, if you're not going to respond to reality in the proper way with the proper dust, which would have meant going to Dun, taking down the pestle the Michad Bat Eretz Israel and saying this can't exist in a Jewish country and get rid of it, then the whole thing by the Pelagish Giva would never have taken place. But it had to take place. Why? Because of the fact that people had to be woken up. They had to be made to feel what they should have felt about the Passover, but didn't feel in the head. People probably went and made Shabbos and said, oh, terrible thing, this statue up and down. What's it doing in Eretz Israel? Someone's going to do something about it. How about we write a representative, right? Or we talk to our governor. Or we send a letter over here. It used to drive me nuts the last few years. I mean, there was a time that was an appropriate response, perhaps, when the Gullus was going on. But they get all worked up, these letters get all worked up and say, this is happening to Jewish people and the land of Eretz Israel, and this and this and this and this, and they finally say, and how to respond? Write your representative in the House of Representatives and tell him what you feel and change the situation. Those days are over. Because Baruch Hu's not looking for that kind of response. That's not the equation over here. So it's I didn't even know last week was the gay parade. Every other year, I've known that it takes place. Every other year I was aware, but that was the last minute. They always did the last minute. They're always changing them because that's like part of the strategy to throw us off, right? So the frum world decided, you know something? We're not going to battle this thing anymore. You know why?
Some did.
There'll always be some to do it. But overall, right, we're not going to battle this because we make a big deal about it. First of all, we can't win. Number one, we can't overcome it. We're not going to stop it. Number two, if we make a big deal about it, and our children will hear about this thing and all the sforas that come in. So instead, we look the other way. In Yerushalayim, this thing is taking place. Now, everyone's confused today. You talk to people, even people who are, modernish, and they have problems with the whole idea of not, allowing gay marriage. Like, you can get really weird conversations today. The Torah was koveya. This is called the to'eva. Now, there's people who are tinnik v'nishpa, and there are people who are confused, there are people who are unhealthy. There's all kinds of things. But, and this is not a judgment on people. This is only a report on history. The Mabul came, you can be sure not everybody was chayiv misa. You can be sure there was a lot of tinnik v'nishpa, people walking around. You can be sure there was a lot of, so to speak, innocent people, confused people, kids walking around. What did they know in the end? It wasn't like everybody was so evil, challenging Noah and saying this whole thing is ridiculous. It wasn't like that. So why did the Kodesh Baruch Hu destroy the world anyhow? Because there are certain gvulot in history. There's a Ma'aseh Bereshis as a purpose in creation, and it could get to the point where people don't know what it actually is and be confused about it. But the bottom line is there's certain gvulot. At a certain time, it... Told you.
Like something.
It looked like a light. It looked like a light that's flying out.
Something with the light. Something about light. The light.
That was very cool.
Organism.
Yeah.
There's one Rav who said Mashiach ben Yosef died Thursday night.
We're not. Yeah. Hmm?
You know who he's talking about.
I know who he's talking. It happened Friday morning.
Thursday night. Baba Eliezer.
That happened Friday morning, didn't it?
I saw Thursday night, but
It happened Thursday night.
Yeah, I saw Thursday night also.
Oh, I didn't see, okay. So I thought a little bit later. I just.
Is the Meraglim tied into this whole idea also that they didn't get it?
Yeah, 100%. The point is like this. There's a story. There's a famous story. The Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was he was walking to shul one Shabbos, and he noticed it was Machal Shabbos. Someone was Machal Shabbos, whatever reason, innocent, not innocent. I don't know if he tried to speak to him, whatever. I don't remember the details. And he went to shul. He continued to shul. Next week, he went to shul again, and he saw the same person in Machal Shabbos again. And as he walked past him, he began to cry. And his Talmidim, they asked him, Rebbe, last week we walked by, the Rebbe didn't cry. He said, this week he walked by, and all of a sudden the Rebbe's crying. What's different this week? He said, I feel less bad about it this week than I did last week. And that's a reason to cry. Somehow I became desensitized to what's going on over here, that, even though it's bad, and I know it shouldn't be like this, I really want to, rectify the situation, I feel better, but the bottom line is that I became desensitized. I was talking to someone who she usually arranges, to heal him every, on a weekly basis, an ongoing basis. But in the past, the response to this parade, right? Again, it's not judgment of people, but it's a reality. Metzius, as the Torah says, this is the To'eva. It doesn't say except in these following situations. It undermines the fabric of my separations. It undermines it. It destroys the purpose of my separation. The Gemara and Tamura says the world was made for Privarivia. It's okay. Please, go ahead. You can lie in mine. The world was made for Privarivia, right? And this totally undermines the fabric of my separations. It's like you have to separate the two realities. You can't just say, well, because they're innocent people, therefore Kosh Baruch Hu puts up with everything. No, but Kosh Baruch Hu, he will put up with a lot. But there are certain things that just totally defy the reason why Kosh Baruch Hu made creation. And so even if you can't go out there and protest and you're not going to start throwing rocks and things like that, it's not going to happen, it's not going to work. But how you feel about it, right, it's going to drive you nuts. Because this is Pinchas avenging Kodesh Baruch Hu. Your anger has to be what Kodesh Baruch Hu feels about this. So even if you're totally powerless, sitting in your living room doing nothing because you can't change the situation, but in here, and cry for the people who are confused at the same time. Not say hate them. Cry for them. Feel bad. Feel how they're being washed along in a mistaken reality, and how bad the world has become, and how much gallows has become so deep. We need Bashir, whatever. But tie it back to a positive thing. But at least don't go on with life as normal.
What could we do to help?
So they, for example, what this group used to do was say, pair kufet base, which is your book, much of your book. So 100, kuf base, they said 112 times corresponding to your book. Your book is a very significant reality, the idea of your book. And they did it every year the last few years. But this year, just water under the bridge, just passed over. Just no one paid attention because helplessness, powerlessness, busy, financial, whatever. But they just passed over, literally, and got forgotten and didn't, and we were less sensitive. We're like the Chavas Chaim, except worse. The next time it's like, okay, we're tired of it. We cannot keep feeling for the situation. So Kosh Baruch Hu says, you don't appreciate how bizarre this thing is. You don't understand how much this goes against, how crazy and how it's off the grid of Yiddishkeit and reality and what it should be doing to you. Okay, so you're powerless to do anything about it, fine, but still, what you're feeling, your lave, your heart. So someone, on the level, right, of a gadol to such a degree, and not only is he nifter, but he's nifter by being stabbed to death by somebody. Is like the shock is unbelievable, and the sense of contemplation, trying to figure out what's going on, and it's hard to compartmentalize and to deal with, but the feeling of shock, like Yosef's brothers. Like really backwards on the Yosef, but they can't get the words out their mouth because there's nothing to be said. They can't be told as anything that might make sense in this situation. We were so wrong and so off. And the Kosh Baruch Hu says that's what you were supposed to have felt yesterday, or earlier today, or in advance of this thing. That's what your heart should be feeling. Are you feeling it now? As far as a person like that, that's not so unusual. Because we know, for example, from Rabbi Kiva, other great people in the past, they also died very, very violent deaths very often. Rabbi Shulot, especially Rabbi Malchus, they died, terrible deaths. Because sometimes, a person gets to the point in their tikkun process where they're so close to the end. What does it say after Rabbi Kiva dies? Ashrecha Rabbi Kiva. Atamucha l'chayla min. That's the lashon of the Gemara. What does it mean, mucha l'chayla min? That means that it means that most people normally, after they leave this world, no matter how good they were, they still require a little bit of gehan to the tikkun along the way before they get to the world to come. They just can't go straight there yet, because as pure as you feel you may have become, you cannot begin to imagine how pure the world to come actually is. It is so beyond understanding how pure and complete it is that one small, tiny little pagam in your life that down here would be absolutely nothing. You wouldn't even think about it, but over there is an ikuv to a higher level in the world to come. So to get to that world to come, to be so close to it, so most people, when they leave this world, after all their gilgulim, they're still so far away from that perfection, they're going to have to go to Gehenna on some level, some way. Even Siddiq.
People come back.
I'm talking about, say, to the end, where there's no longer any history left to come back anymore. So close to the end, right? There might be some more time, but for the most part, probably we're so close to the end that I don't know how much time is for a lifetime of Gilgul of Tikkun at this point in time. We're so close to, they're still going to have to require tikkun. They may come back, or they may just go to Gehenna. It depends on the Baruch Hu's cheshbon. But some people, through all their tzidkus and their godliness and their greatness, they get so close to the end, not exactly finished, because there's what's to rectify, but so little is left at that point in time that does not warrant another life to come back and rectify that. It would last for maybe a few seconds, a few moments, that's it. A little bit more of Yisurim. So what does the Kodesh Baruch Hu do? He uses Gevurus. The Holocaust is a tremendous example of that. It was bizarre to us. What's hard to us, Rabbi Kiva, to witness Rabbi Kiva dying and Petradian and all this good, so Arugis Malchus and this God at the same time, to witness him dying would be harsher because it doesn't fit into our picture of what reality should look like. But from a tikkun perspective, you could see it from a Kodesh Baruch Hu's perspective, you would see somebody who probably had a little bit of tikkun left to go, and to spare him having to go to any Gehenna after his lifetime because he's so close to the end, no need to come back another Gilgal. This finishes off the job completely. Ashrecha, in the end, Mitzad himself. But Mitzadenu, from our perspective, our side, that's the equation. It's at 11 all through history. We've been working on the entire 10. That das, we've been trying to achieve the entire 10 that has to be plugged in. That perspective, that understanding, that ultimately speaking, a person has to look at themselves and say, how much Esav is actually in me? How Esav-like have I become? I'm definitely Yaakov. You should know living in Israel is a big plus. It's a big idea, as the Malbim points out, that this is one of the final test of who's a Yaakov and who's a Yisrael at the end of history, where you choose to live your life and the reason why you come here in the first place. But it's more than simply being a Yisrael over Yaakov. To be a Yaakov is because a person is still attached to being an Esav. There's still an aspect of that twin brother part that's within us. To finish the equation, a person has to get back, or at least achieve the level of das that allows him to see the world the way Kodesh Baruch Hu sees the world. And that's why it's called Shabbos Chazan. And again, we go from Dibur to Shmiya, right, to vision itself. It's all about vision. The Gemara says, Kol b'du Shemayim, chutz miyir Shemayim. And as Chazal points out, we're not talking about simply developing a fear of punishment because you get punished at some point in time, so I'll do the right thing because I don't want to get punished later on. It's not about that. It's about developing a vision, a perspective of reality that matches that of the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Once you do that, that's the 11. It allows you to see the 25, to transform into 36, the Gilui Hashchina, Gilui of the Or, Gilui of your own personal Or, to be a part of the Kodesh Baruch Hu, in the Shlemus of Ma'aseh Bereshis. And in, as much as we do that, we mitigate the effects of history and anti-Semitism. That's what it means to be an Or Lagoyim, and then we're allowed to cross the threshold of Mashiach in a much more merciful and peaceful way.